I moved into the apartment 2 months ago. It wasn't anything fancy, just a standard two-bedroom in an older building downtown. The kind of place where the floorboards creak when you walk, and you can hear your neighbors' muffled conversations through the walls. The rent was cheap because I'd be sharing it with a guy named Kyle, who, according to the landlord, had been living there for a few years already. Kyle seemed nice enough when I met him. He was quiet, a bit awkward maybe, but polite. He worked late shifts at a warehouse and mentioned that I probably wouldn't see him much. That suited me just fine. I liked my space and wasn't looking for a best friend, just someone who wouldn't steal my food or blast music at 3 a.m. For the first week, everything was fine. Kyle would come home around midnight, and I'd hear the soft shuffle of his footsteps heading straight to his room. By the time I got up in the morning, he was gone. We'd exchange the occasional hey if we crossed paths, but that was about it. Then, one night, I noticed something odd. I was watching TV in the living room, and I heard Kyle come in as usual. His footsteps were slow and deliberate, like he was trying to be extra quiet. I glanced at the clock, 11:47 p.m., right on schedule. I expected to hear his bedroom door close, but instead, the footsteps stopped right outside the living room. I waited, feeling a bit weirded out. After a few seconds, I called out, "Hey, Kyle, everything okay?" No answer. The footsteps started again, this time heading down the hall to his room. The door clicked shut, and I shrugged it off. Maybe he just paused to take off his shoes or something. But it kept happening. Every night, like clockwork, Kyle would come home, stop outside the living room, and stand there for a few seconds before continuing to his room. I started to wonder if he was checking on me or just being nosy, but it didn't feel threatening, just strange. About 3 weeks in, I realized I hadn't actually seen Kyle in days. I'd hear him come in at night and leave in the morning, but our paths hadn't crossed at all. His door was always shut, and I figured he was just keeping to himself. Then one evening, I came home late after a long shift at work. The apartment was dark except for a faint light under Kyle's door. I went to the kitchen, made a quick sandwich, and sat down at the table to eat. That's when I noticed the sound, quiet, rhythmic tapping coming from his room. It wasn't loud, but it was constant, like someone drumming their fingers on a desk. I ignored it at first, but after about 15 minutes, it started to get under my skin. I decided to knock on his door and ask if everything was okay. "Kyle," I called out, rapping my knuckles lightly on the wood. The tapping stopped instantly. I waited, but there was no response. "Hey, just checking if you're good." Still nothing. I felt a small chill creep up my spine, but I shook it off and went to bed. The next morning, I noticed something even weirder. The door to Kyle's room was wide open, and the room was completely empty. No bed, no furniture, nothing. Just bare walls and an old carpet. It looked like no one had lived there in years. I stood there, staring, trying to process what I was seeing. My first thought was that Kyle had moved out without telling me, but I'd heard him come in last night. I'd heard the tapping. My chest tightened as I remembered all those nights I'd heard footsteps and assumed it was him. I called the landlord, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hey, did Kyle move out or something?" There was a long pause before she replied. "Who's Kyle?" "My roommate," I said, my voice rising slightly. "The guy who's been living here for years." The landlord sounded confused. "You're the only tenant in that unit. There hasn't been anyone else on the lease since 2018. I hung up, my hands shaking. That night, I locked my bedroom door and left a lamp on. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again. Slow, deliberate, and stopping right outside my door. This time, I didn't call out. I just sat there, frozen, until they finally moved away. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I packed a bag and left. I didn't care about losing the deposit or breaking the lease. Whatever was living in that apartment wasn't human, and I wasn't sticking around to find out what it wanted. Even now, weeks later, I still hear those footsteps sometimes. In the hallway outside my new place. They always stop, just for a moment, like they're waiting for me to notice. I moved into the apartment with high hopes. It was a small two-bedroom, a bit dated but cozy, in a quiet part of town. The kind of place you'd find in a roommates wanted ad on Craigslist. My new roommate, Greg, seemed pretty chill when we met for the first time. Mid-30s, works in tech, keeps to himself. I figured we'd get along fine. For the first month, things went smoothly. Greg worked from home most days, but we rarely bumped into each other. He spent most of his time in his room, and I spent mine in mine or out with friends. I'd hear him typing away on his computer or making the occasional phone call, but that was about it. He was quiet, clean, and paid his share of the rent on time. Perfect roommate material. Then one night, I noticed something odd. I was brushing my teeth when I thought I heard muffled voices coming from Greg's room. It sounded like he was having a conversation with someone. That wouldn't have been weird, except I hadn't seen anyone come into the apartment all evening. The next morning, I casually asked, "Hey, did you have someone over last night?" Greg looked up from his laptop, a bit startled. "No, why?" I shrugged. "I thought I heard voices, that's all." He laughed nervously. "Probably the TV. I like to leave it on when I fall asleep." Seemed plausible, so I let it go. But the voices didn't stop. Every few nights, I'd hear them. Low, murmuring tones coming from his room. It wasn't just one voice either. It sounded like a conversation between 2 or 3 people. I told myself it was just the TV, but the more I listened, the more I started to doubt that. The voices didn't sound like they were coming from speakers. They were too clear, too real. And sometimes, I swore I heard Greg's voice in the mix, arguing or whispering back. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I crept down the hall and pressed my ear to Greg's door. The voices stopped immediately. I froze, holding my breath, half expecting the door to swing open, but nothing happened. After a minute, I hurried back to my room, my heart pounding. The next morning, I found Greg sitting at the kitchen table, staring into his coffee like he hadn't slept all night. His face looked pale, almost sickly. "Rough night?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He didn't look up. "You hear them too, don't you?" My stomach dropped. "What?" "The voices," he said, his tone flat. "You've heard them." I felt a lump form in my throat. "I thought it was the TV." Greg shook his head. "It's not the TV. It's them." "Who's them?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He looked at me, his eyes dark and sunken. "The ones who were here before us." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to laugh it off, but the look on his face told me he wasn't joking. "I don't know what they want," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "But they don't leave." "Not really." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "Greg, are you okay? Maybe you should—" "I found their things," he interrupted, his voice trembling. "In the crawl space under the floorboards. Old photos, clothes, journals. They lived here. They died here." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What are you talking about?" He got up suddenly and walked down the hall. I followed him, my heart racing. He opened his bedroom door and pointed to a loose floorboard near his bed. "Go ahead," he said. "Look." I hesitated before crouching down and prying up the board. Sure enough, there was a small, dark space beneath it. Inside, I found a dusty pile of old belongings, a leather-bound journal, a faded photograph of a family, and what looked like a child's toy. My hands were shaking as I pulled them out. "They don't like it when you move their things," Greg said quietly. Before I could respond, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, but Greg wasn't there. The room was empty. The air felt heavy, suffocating, like the walls were closing in on me. Then I heard it, the voices, louder this time, surrounding me, overlapping in a chaotic chorus. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the anger in their tone was unmistakable. I bolted out of the room and ran for the front door, but it wouldn't budge. The voices grew louder, almost deafening, until I thought I might pass out. I screamed Greg's name, but there was no response. Finally, The door gave way, and I stumbled out into the hallway. I didn't stop running until I was outside, gasping for air under the streetlights. I called the landlord the next day, demanding answers, but all he said was, "Greg? There's no Greg on the lease. You've been living alone since you moved in." I never went back to that apartment. I left everything behind: furniture, clothes, even my laptop. I didn't care. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder if Greg was real, if he was just another part of whatever was in that place. Or maybe I was the one who wasn't supposed to be there. When I moved into the apartment, it was an upgrade in every sense of the word. Modern appliances, great lighting, even a balcony with a decent view of the city. The only downside was the price, which was why I had to find a roommate. Enter Rachel. Rachel was a bit quirky, but that wasn't a deal breaker. She was an artist, always working on some abstract piece in her room or sketching quietly in the living room. She had a certain charm: wavy dark hair, always in oversized sweaters, the kind of person who seemed perpetually lost in thought. We got along fine at first. She didn't talk much, but when she did, her voice was soft and deliberate, like she was picking each word carefully. She had one strange habit, though. She loved mirrors. She had a small collection of them: ornate frames, vintage hand mirrors, even a full-length one she kept propped up in the corner of her room. "It helps with my work," she said when I asked about it. "Reflections show things differently. You know, angles and perspectives." I didn't press further. Artists, right? A few weeks in, I started noticing odd things. Little details that didn't make sense. For instance, Rachel always locked her bedroom door when she wasn't home. No big deal. It's her space. But sometimes I'd hear noises from her room when I knew she was out. Soft thuds, like someone walking, or the faint creak of floorboards. One night, I was in the bathroom brushing my teeth, and I swear I saw Rachel's reflection in the hallway mirror. She wasn't there when I turned around, though. Just an empty hall. I laughed it off, chalking it up to my tired eyes playing tricks on me. But it stuck with me, that momentary flicker of movement, like she'd been standing there, watching. Things escalated about a month later. I was home alone. Rachel had gone to visit family for the weekend. When I started hearing faint noises from her room, it was late, around midnight, and I was watching TV when I heard the first sound. A faint rustling, like someone shifting in bed. I muted the TV and listened. The apartment was dead silent, except for that noise. I stood up, my heart thudding in my chest, and crept toward her door. I knocked lightly. "Rachel?" I called out, even though I knew she wasn't there. No response. I tried the doorknob, but it was locked. Then I saw it, movement in the reflection of the hallway mirror. Rachel's face, pale and wide-eyed, staring back at me. Only it wasn't her exactly. The expression on her face was wrong, unnatural, almost predatory. I whipped around, but the hallway was empty. My breath caught in my throat, and I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the mirror. Her reflection stayed there, watching me, until I reached my room and slammed the door. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I called Rachel to ask when she'd be back. She sounded normal, cheerful even, like nothing was wrong. I didn't mention what I'd seen. What could I say? "Hey, I think your reflection is stalking me." When she returned, things got worse. I started catching glimpses of her reflection in places she wasn't. Mirrors, windows, even the black screen of the TV. Sometimes, the reflection moved when she didn't, tilting its head or smiling faintly while the real Rachel stared blankly at her sketchbook. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in my room. My heart froze as I saw Rachel standing at the foot of my bed, her face half lit by the glow of the streetlights outside. She wasn't moving, just staring at me. "Rachel?" I whispered, my voice trembling. She tilted her head, but didn't respond. I reached for my phone to turn on the flashlight, and when the beam hit the spot where she'd been standing, she was gone. Just like that. Panicking, I ran to her room and pounded on the door. She opened it after a moment, looking groggy and confused. "What's going on?" she asked, rubbing her eyes. "You were just in my room," I stammered. "No, I wasn't," she said, frowning. "I've been asleep." I didn't believe her, but there was no point arguing. I went back to my room and locked the door. A few nights later, I decided to confront her. I couldn't take it anymore. I waited until she left for her art class and broke into her room. It was unsettling. Mirrors covered every wall, and there were strange markings drawn in charcoal around the edges of each one. Symbols I didn't recognize. In the center of the room was an old, tarnished mirror, taller than me, with a cracked frame. It gave off this odd feeling, like the air around it was heavier. As I stepped closer, I saw Rachel, or something that looked like her, inside the mirror. She smiled at me, a slow, twisted grin, and whispered something I couldn't hear. I stumbled back, tripping over a stack of books, and bolted out of the room. That was the last straw. I packed my things and left the next day. I didn't even tell Rachel I was leaving. I just couldn't. Now, in my new apartment, I keep all mirrors covered. I don't care how irrational it seems, because sometimes when I catch my reflection out of the corner of my eye, I swear it's smiling when I'm not. I met Danny through a roommate finder app. He was clean, friendly, and had a stable job working nights at some call center. When I first moved into the apartment, I couldn't believe my luck. Danny was the perfect roommate. He kept the place tidy, didn't throw wild parties, and always paid rent on time. The only weird thing about him, I never saw him eat. At first, I thought it was just a scheduling thing. I worked regular hours, and he worked nights, so our paths rarely crossed during meals. But after a month, I started to notice the little details, the empty fridge, the spotless counters. Even when he was home on weekends, he never joined me for dinner or grabbed a snack. One evening, I joked, "Man, do you ever eat? Or are you secretly a robot?" Danny laughed. "I eat. I'm just not big on cooking. Usually grab something at work." It seemed like a reasonable explanation, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The way he said it felt rehearsed, like he was deflecting. About 6 weeks in, I started noticing strange noises at night. It always happened after I'd gone to bed. Soft scraping sounds, like furniture being dragged across the floor, and faint thumps that seemed to come from the walls. At first, I assumed it was the neighbors. Our building wasn't exactly soundproof, and I'd often hear muffled voices or footsteps from upstairs. But one night, the sounds were so loud that I got up to investigate. I walked down the hall and stopped outside Danny's door. The noises were definitely coming from inside. It sounded like something heavy being moved around, followed by a low, rhythmic creaking. My stomach twisted as I imagined him dragging furniture in the middle of the night for no apparent reason. I knocked softly. "Danny? You okay in there?" The noises stopped immediately. There was a long pause before I heard his voice, muffled and strained. "Yeah, everything's fine. Go back to bed." I didn't push it, but as I walked back to my room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. A few days later, I decided to see if Danny was telling the truth about eating at work. It wasn't like I was trying to spy on him. I just wanted to understand what was going on. So, I checked the fridge. Nothing. Not even a carton of milk or a bottle of ketchup. I opened the cabinets. Same story. Completely bare. That night, I stayed up late, pretending to watch TV in the living room. Around 2 a.m., Danny came home. I heard the front door open and his familiar footsteps heading down the hall to his room. I waited, listening, as the sound started up again. Scraping, thumping, and that strange creaking noise. This time, I decided to confront him. I walked down the hall and knocked on his door, harder this time. "Danny, seriously? What are you doing in there?" There was no response. The sound stopped, and the apartment fell eerily silent. "Danny?" I tried again, but there was nothing. I turned the doorknob. Locked. Frustrated and more than a little creeped out, I went back to bed. The breaking point came a week later. I'd taken the day off work and was lounging on the couch when I heard footsteps above me. That was strange because Danny was supposed to be at work. Curious, I went to his room and found the door wide open. It was empty. Completely empty. No bed, no furniture, no clothes. Just bare walls and a thin layer of dust on the floor, like no one had lived there in years. Panicking, I called the landlord. "Hey, where's Danny?" I blurted out as soon as he answered. There was a long pause. "Danny?" the landlord repeated, his tone confused. "You mean the guy who lived there before you?" "What?" I said, my voice rising. "Danny's my roommate. He's been living here for months." The landlord sighed. "There's no Danny on your lease. You've been the only tenant since you moved in. The last guy, Danny, moved out over a year ago." I hung up and paced the apartment, trying to make sense of what I just heard. That's when I noticed the faint smell, a sickly, metallic odor wafting up from the basement. My heart pounded as I opened the door to the basement stairs. The smell hit me like a wall, thick and nauseating. I stepped down slowly, my hand trembling on the railing. The basement was dimly lit, the only light coming from a single, flickering bulb. In the corner, I saw it. A pile of bones, picked clean, and a stack of old, blood-stained furniture. And then I heard it, the soft creak of footsteps behind me. I turned around and saw Danny standing at the top of the stairs, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes dark and hollow. "I told you I eat," he said, his voice low and cold. "Just not what you think." I ran, shoving past him and out of the apartment. I didn't stop running until I was halfway across the city. I never went back to that apartment. I didn't even tell anyone what I saw. Who would believe me? But sometimes, late at night, I still hear those faint scraping sounds in my dreams. And when I wake up, I swear I can smell that same metallic odor lingering in the air. When I moved into the old house, it felt like a dream come true. I'd always wanted a place with character, and this one had it in spades. Hardwood floors, arched doorways, even a little attic that came with the rental. The landlord warned me that the house was old, so there might be quirks, but I didn't mind. I liked quirky. The only catch was that I needed a roommate to afford it. Enter Alex. Alex was a little eccentric, but in a fun way. Always wearing vintage clothes, obsessed with obscure indie bands, and constantly doodling in a little sketchbook. She moved in about a week after I did, claiming the second bedroom as her own. We got along well, mostly keeping to ourselves but chatting over coffee in the mornings or beers at night. The first time I heard the noises, I thought it was the house settling. It was just a faint shuffling sound, like something moving overhead. I didn't think much of it. Attics make noises, right? But over the next few nights, the sounds got louder. Footsteps, soft and deliberate, pacing back and forth above my bedroom. I mentioned it to Alex one morning. "You hear anything weird at night? From the attic?" She shrugged. "Old house. Probably just the wind or squirrels or something." It made sense, so I let it go. But the noises didn't stop. A few weeks later, I was home alone when I noticed something strange. The door to the attic, which was always locked, was slightly ajar. I stared at it for a moment, feeling a weird mix of curiosity and unease. I hadn't been up there since moving in. There was nothing I needed to store, and the landlord had mentioned it was mostly empty. I approached the door slowly and peeked inside. The attic was dark, with only a sliver of light from a small, grimy window. I could see dusty wooden beams and old insulation, but nothing unusual. I was about to close the door when I noticed something. Footprints in the dust, leading to a corner where the shadows were thickest. I froze. The landlord had said no one had been up here in years. So how were there fresh footprints? I backed away and shut the door, locking it tightly. When Alex came home later, I told her what I'd seen. She laughed it off. "Probably your imagination. Dust can look like footprints if the light hits it right." but I knew what I'd seen. That night, the footsteps started again, louder this time. They weren't just pacing. They sounded frantic, almost like someone running back and forth. My heart pounded as I lay in bed, listening. I wanted to believe it was just the house creaking, but it was too deliberate, too human. The next morning, I confronted Alex. "We need to check the attic." She frowned. "Why? It's just an old house." "Because someone's up there," I said, my voice trembling. "I heard them last night, running." Alex hesitated, but eventually agreed. Together, we went to the attic door. I unlocked it and swung it open, half expecting someone to jump out at us. But the attic was empty, just like before. No footprints this time, no sign of anything unusual. I felt stupid. Maybe I'm just paranoid. Alex nodded, but she looked uneasy too. That night, I woke up to the sound of something scratching at the attic door. Long, slow scratches, like nails dragging against the wood. I held my breath, gripping the blanket tightly, too scared to move. The scratching stopped, but then I heard it, footsteps, descending the attic stairs. They stopped right outside my bedroom door. The next day, I didn't go to work. I called the landlord instead, demanding answers. At first, he acted confused, but when I mentioned the noises, he grew quiet. You didn't open the attic, did you?" he asked, his voice tight. "Yes," I said. "Why?" There was a long pause before he sighed. "Look, I didn't want to scare you, but the last tenant claimed someone was living up there. A squatter, maybe. The police never found anyone, but strange things happened." "Strange like what?" I asked, my voice rising. She said she saw someone in the mirrors. Not her reflection, someone else. She moved out after a month. I hung up, my hands shaking. I decided then and there that I was leaving. I started packing immediately, shoving clothes and essentials into a suitcase. Alex came home as I was zipping it up. "Whoa," she said. "What's going on?" "I'm leaving," I said. "This place is wrong." Alex tilted her head, a small, unsettling smile creeping across her face. "You can't leave." My blood ran cold. "What?" "This is his house," she said, her voice calm, almost soothing. "You're just a guest." I stepped back, my heart hammering in my chest. "What are you talking about?" Alex didn't answer. She just turned and walked into her room, shutting the door behind her. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room, my suitcase by my side, waiting for dawn. Around 3 a.m., I heard the attic door creak open. I didn't move, didn't breathe, as the footsteps came down the stairs and stopped just behind me. I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. By morning, I was gone. I left everything behind: furniture, clothes, even my car keys. I don't know what Alex meant, and I don't want to know. But sometimes, when I'm alone in my new apartment, I swear I hear footsteps above me. And once, just once, I saw a shadow move in the corner of my mirror.